Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Let me know how's the volume, because we don't actually have a microphone, which we could, but it was too much of a hassle, to be honest. Everybody okay with the volume? We'll do our best to project. I think I'll probably be the quietest one, so. All right, so just a couple of housekeeping details, quick. The bathroom's right here, and then there's a little kitchen back here to the right if you need water. There's tea and snacks, help yourself. And we are really glad to have everybody here tonight. Thank you, because I know I just still have flashbacks, I'm sure we all do, to COVID, and it's just like, I feel so thankful that we can all be together and not on the computer all the time. I think it's all good. It's good for our mental health. So thank you so much. So let's see, any other housekeeping details that we need to go over? I don't think so.
Good.
So Michael and I both work for Underwood Conservation District. I'm Corey Podolak, and I do our backyard habitat program as well as our outreach and education. So that's my role. And then this is our staff. Right now it's 10 of us. These two, Dan and Mike, are CTD, which is a Center for Technical Development. They help with training programs throughout Washington State for conservation districts. But Jan is in our office, so. And that's kind of a quick overview of our staff. And then one of our programs, just wanting people to know of the programs that we have so that you guys are aware of them. We have this food and farm tool library, which is great. James was here earlier. He runs that program, and it's we have all kinds of tools, everything from fire mitigation tools, loppers and basics, shovels and everything you can imagine. And then up to bigger implements like a no-till seed drill, a yeoman's plow. And then this last year or two, we have food processing items as well. So something to be aware of when you're needing a really good food dehydrator. We have like 3 or 4, and they're really good ones too. So, and then wanted to also just make you guys aware that there's we're part of the Wind River Nursery. And we're going to start doing an annual fall plant sale. This is our second one. And it was in conjunction with Logtoberfest, so it was a pretty fun festival up in Carson. And if you're on our newsletter, you can find out details about these events. Crop Talks is a really fun way for farmers to get together and share knowledge and practices that they have either had successes, failures. They can share all of that, and it's really fun potluck event that we do between April and September, and it's in conjunction with Gorge Food Network. So we do it in Oregon and Washington at 7 different farms. So that's a fun thing that we host. Yard by Yard is the program I'm running. We're trying to get more and more participants. What we do is look for, there's criteria on our website, of course, but some of the basics are just water conservation, planting more native plants, trying to think about wildlife conservation, and just being more responsible in our practices, limiting or eliminating pesticides, that kind of thing. So if you're interested, let me know. We also have our annual tree fest, which has been going on for a while now. We sell bare roots at this one, bare root plants, let's say, at this one. And it's a really fun event, but we also turned into more of a festival type thing. So that is March 21st this year. So hopefully you can join us in Weingarten Park. And also we do a lot of stream habitat projects, everything from big to small projects. And that's another big part of our work, to try to help specifically with helping with fish habitats and just healthier riparian stream health, essentially. And that will be my part of this. And then Michael's gonna come on up and talk a little bit about our forest health program.
Yeah, super quickly. Super
Yeah, we'll
quickly.
try to keep this quick. We want to get to the speakers.
Hey everyone, my name is Michael McNorville. I'm the Forest Health and Wildfire Resilience Specialist for Underwood Conservation District. I was brought on about 2 years ago to try and expand our program because at the time, Washington invested a ton of money through the Climate Commitment Act into wildfire mitigation and forest health services. And so what we've been able to do over the past couple of years is really lean into home ignition zone assessments for folks, making sure that given that embers are pretty much the primary cause of structural ignition during wildfire, making sure that folks have cleaned up the litter around their house, have suitable building materials, or at least are aware of the least ignition prone building materials around their home, dealing with the landscaping, 100 feet, 150 feet, 250 feet from their main home structure. So that's the first big thing we do with our wildfire resilience program. Second thing is fuels reduction, specifically with chipping. So for folks who get assessments done through us, whether that's the standard home ignition zone assessment or a forest health assessment, if you're not necessarily totally concerned about your house, more concerned about your trees, that all allows you to be eligible for our mobile chipping program, which happens every fall and spring, is totally free of charge. You get 2 hours of chipping from a 2 to 4 person crew that if you've got your pile all set, they'll come and just chip it, leave you the wood chips. Pretty good deal. Other things that we have been able to do in the past, capacities notwithstanding, those forest health assessments I just mentioned, community fuels reduction as well. So if you're part of a larger community that a bunch of people are pretty into the idea of being fire safe, those community-wide projects tend to be the most effective at reducing ignition hazards around your homes. Otherwise, we also assist in FireWise USA certification, which has a bunch of benefits, not only aligning with your neighbors about how to be wildfire safe, but also potentially microgrant access through the Department of Natural Resources, stuff like that. Wildfire preparedness planning, we are just finishing up our Skamania County Community Wildfire Protection Plan. That has been a 1.5 year, almost 2 year trudge in many ways, but also really awesome to be able to connect with all these different partners throughout the county. And we're hoping to do the same as Clickattack gets on their renewal of their community wildfire protection plan as well. Lastly, we do seminars, trainings, workshops like this one, and kind of new to us, not something that we've done a ton of historically, but what we've done since the Tunnel 5 fire back in 2023, and then also with Burdoin and Rowena, we've been leaning into post-fire recovery as much as we have capacity. So one of the things that we were able to do this summer after the Burdoin fire was offer technical assistance in the form of just post-fire assessments, looking at people's soils, their trees, mortality of their understory plants, all that jazz, just to let them know whether or not to be worried. Oftentimes it was just wait and see until spring, but we try to give them as much information as we can. Other things we were able to do was provide seed and trees to be able to stabilize especially steep slopes that were burned out, provide tools, not only through the farm tool library, but also through some other grant programs. And then of course, we've got our chipping service, which is also really appropriate for reducing fuels after a fire. And this year we were able to help over 30 landowners get their properties assessed, figure out what they needed, seed, tools, trees, and provide it to them with funding from the Natural Resource Conservation Service at the federal level. And then also DNR provided some post-fire grant funding after the Burdoin fire. But that has been really cool to work on with folks. We have other winter workshops that are incoming. So if you decide that this was super fun and you want to hear more from specialized speakers, we've got this on our website, but just a couple of dates to keep in mind. And now to turn it over to our first speaker, Jim White. We love Jim White not only because he's a former director, manager of UCD, but also because he spent 30 years with the Forest Service as a silviculturalist, somebody who manages tree plantings and cuttings in a hopefully sustainable way, and he'll talk to you more about that. He's also the board chair of the Mount Adams Resource Stewards, who are a close partner of ours up in the Trout Lake area. Super cool, super active community group. And he's also active with the Washington Farm Forestry Association chapter, Fire Adaptive Community of Trout Lake, and the South Gifford Pinchot National Forest Collaborative. Jim will be discussing the fact that Washington's forests contend with a range of both native and some introduced insects and diseases, and also some pathogens like fungi, viruses, bacteria, that can ultimately weaken or kill trees on your landscape, something that is increasingly more pertinent as conditions continue to change in our area. And though these natural disturbance agencies play an ecological role in the most historic of conditions, outbreaks can reduce carbon storage, create water quality, all these pretty deleterious effects. So Jim is going to talk to us a little bit about that and what he's learned over the past 30, 40 years studying the trees. Yeah, take it away, Jim.
Thanks for the introduction, Michael. You covered half my talk. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'll tell you a story. In about 1982, I live in Trout Lake, and I had to talk as a young man in front of the Trout Lake Community Council, maybe a group about this size. And an elderly lady who was chairman of the council, she interrupted me about 2 sentences in, and she said, "Young man, if you would open your mouth when you spoke, you would be understood." Those are her exact words. I'll never forget that. So I've always remembered that when I'm speaking, but I think I project pretty well. You guys are gonna have to help me find the presentation here.
Got a little clicker here if you want to use it. Okay, just click that right hand button. Oh, as well as being in the
Hold
right.
up, that's the one.
Yeah. Got you.
Slideshow. There we go. We got her. Okay. Again, my name is Jim White. I've lived in Trout Lake for 45 years. As these guys have said, I was manager of the Underwood Conservation District. I remember when we had 3 employees. So it's not quite the list they have there. Barbara here is one of the supervisors currently of the district, so volunteer supervisor, appreciate her. And they've done a lot of stuff. As you can see, the district's been real active and has done a lot of good stuff. Anyway, I'm going to talk about some common insect diseases in some of our Northwest forests. And I'm talking about, this is mainly conifers. And this will just give you a taste, but hopefully that'll help you. An excellent guide I brought with me, in fact, I used it for putting in a lot of this presentations, is this field guide to insects and diseases in Oregon and Washington. Great thing. Now, I don't know that you can get this anymore. I think you were saying maybe you could, but it's online. You can get this online for free. Download it. Great, an outstanding publication. You can also get the Forest Service has what are called forest pest leaflets. They've had these for decades, and if any particular insect or disease problem you might have, you can go online, you can find one of these, again, download one. They're just great resources. And Washington Department of Natural Resources, I said that before I say DNR, so everybody knows the acronym. Sharon Frazee, their local forester, is here. And, they've got a lot of excellent information also on their page. So there's a lot of good stuff out there for you. One thing I wanted to point out is that most of the insect and disease stuff we have they're native plants and animals. So even though we talk about them maybe being pests and we talk about controlling them and the like, always have to remember that they're part of the ecosystem. It's not like there's some evil thing. In fact, I like to use an example of this old book. This is called Western Forest Insects. Again, I don't think they publish this anymore, but I've got an old copy. And it looks like that. You want to know what it said before that? The title before that was The Insect Enemies of Western Forests. Does that tell you how we've changed the way we're thinking of these things? We sometimes do need to control some of these agents. Oh, they're there for a reason, and a lot of them do some good. Remember too, when you have a problem with your trees, it may be something else. Think about wildlife or weather. It could be us. It could be the planting job you did. It could be air pollution. It could be a lot of things. There may be other things other than insects and diseases. In fact, this little book, I'd really recommend you, if you're interested, download that thing. It has a wonderful little chart in here that just tells you some things to look for. Look for symptoms. Look for what do you see in the way of signs? How about any patterns that exist in the context you're in? That can really help you. In fact, I always like to think of the one that says windward exposed side of the tree. How many of you ever gone up and down the gorge in the winter and seen that some of the Douglas fir are all brown on one side? And then when you turn around, you come back from Portland, they're all green because we get some desiccation from strong, dry eastern winds, and nothing to do with insects and diseases. It's a physical thing. So think about things like that, you know, if you have problems, with your forest, think about stuff like that. Okay, the first thing I'll just quickly talk about is bark beetles. And basically, these are insects that they live under the tree bark, and they have, I think most of them have 4 life stages. They have an egg, larva, pupa, and adult. And what they do is they feed on the tree cambium. The adult bores into the tree, digs itself a gallery, lays eggs, and they feed the cambium. And they love weeping trees, and that is because their enemy is sap. A beetle, when it bores into the tree, a lot of them are drowned by sap. But sap, what is sap? It's mostly water. And if a tree is weakened by drought or too many trees stressed, that may mean it produces less sap than normal and a greater chance it can get big damage. Sap is their enemy. They frequently occur in combination with other agents such as root diseases, and they usually display pitch pockets or boring frass. Usually where they bore in, you'll have some pitch that comes out and may have killed the beetle, but at least you have these little pitch pockets where you may see some frass, and which is kind of like a fine boring dust, stuff like that. And a lot of them can be identified by their gallery shapes. This one here, you look at the one on the upper right, is the Douglas fir beetle. They all have distinctive galleries. They bore into the tree, and the adult lays eggs, and then the little guys mine the cambium. That's how they kill the trees. They're basically eating the growth layer of the tree. And the species have distinctive gallery shapes. Here's the first one I'll talk the Douglas fir beetle, and here's the Douglas fir beetle gallery. And you can see they've got a very distinct. They're on one side and then the other, side. So they're kind of distinctive. It can still be difficult for. That's why I always say, you know, call in an expert if you can, because you have to be able to chop into the bark and pop it away to see these things. And sometimes it can be very difficult to do that. But anyway, Douglas fir can particularly increase after damage. In 2012, we had a big ice storm in the gorge in the area, and after that, we had a lot of Douglas fir beetle. And what happens is you get enough dead material on the ground, but it's still green, but they're not producing pitch. They can build up in there, and when there's enough of them, sometimes they can get into a nearby healthy tree enough to kill that tree, and you get this small pocket of death. But then it usually dies off because those beetles, there's not enough of them to produce enough young to go after the next tree. So it usually drops off after a couple of years. So after if you ever get a lot of windstorm or ice damage, that's when you can get Douglas fir beetle. Another one we commonly have here is a pine engraver. A lot of us around here are familiar with that because in the last 10 years, we've had a lot of pine mortality from the pine engraver. In fact, UCD's been involved with some projects helping people clean up after the pine engraver. The gallery's got kind of a U shape, but they like thin bark, so the pine engraver usually gets the top of a tree or the branches where the bark's thinner, or small trees. So if you see a tree with just the top half dead, a pine, you know, it might very well be this one. And in the last 10 years, the ips we've had in the ips is the genus for the pine engraver in the gorge here has really attacked some bigger trees even. And about 10 or 15 years ago, we had a Skamania County extension agent named Todd Murray. He's an entomologist. And when Todd was here, he actually put out some pheromone traps to see what kind of beetles we had. He put one in my place up in Trout Lake, and he found we had both Ips pinei, which we've always known we had, pine engraver, and the California 5-spined Ips found that too. And it may be that the California 5-spined Ip was one, I think it's the one that was doing most of the damage. But whether it was coming in or whether we always had them, we just didn't know. We're not sure, but we got 2 species here. Up where I am, we had more of the pine engraver. Down here, we have more of the California 5-spined Ips. No jokes about things moving up in California, please. But and they can kill large trees as well. They've done lots of damage in the gorge over the last 10 years. The thing to do with pine engraver is avoid creating fresh slash in the spring and early summer. What can happen then if you have enough slash on the ground? Think about it. Then there's that can't produce any sap, so the insects can build up in there and then they can move to nearby trees. It takes a lot, though. We had a thinning 10 years ago up by Glenwood of a ponderosa pine stand. And we guarded it with the tops attached, so most of the limbs were taken off, but there were still lots of limbs out in the woods like you do after you have a logging operation. And we had an entomologist up from DNR, Glenn Kohler. And Glenn said, yeah, you'll get some ips in here, but there's not enough to cause them to really cause damage to the stand. Well, that summer, my grandson did his senior project in that stand, teaching sixth graders how orienteering, how to use a compass. Sure enough, we had ips. You could see the little frass. We had it all over. I was showing the kids what a ips beetle looked like, but there was not enough to damage the stand. So in light amounts, it can not be a problem, but it's still a good practice to avoid creating fresh slash in spring and early summer. You know, if you have to do that, do it in the winter, this time of year. And that way you'll minimize the chance. And I've seen it where people have dropped trees that were dying and then didn't do anything for a few weeks, and all of a sudden they started losing more trees because they had ips. Another one, the western pine beetle, usually prefers larger diameter trees. And what you do with that one, it bore in under the bark, and they have kind of, as you can see, kind of a sinuous gallery pattern. They don't get in the bark quite as deep, or the beetles don't, and woodpeckers will get in there and eat them. They peck away the outer bark and find them. And quite often with western pine beetle, if you see a tree where it's a lot of bark's gone and you see some of this reddish bark, that's might be a good sign you've got western pine beetle. In fact, how many of you are familiar? You ever see the Trout Lake Big Tree, which was one of the world's largest ponderosa pines, about 200 feet tall and 7-8 feet in diameter? Well, that died in 2015, and you might be able to tell by that picture, but if you look up toward the middle, it's a little redder. That had western pine beetle. Now, western pine beetle is a native insect. That was a very old tree. I don't, you know, it contributed, but you know, I think that tree was losing out anyway. But another one we have, but I don't think it's as serious as like it's the mountain pine beetle, and that can be an alpine species. And they have long straight galleries with a crook at the end, and you'll get lots of pitch tubes. Again, they attack weaker trees, but they can greatly increase in severe outbreaks, particularly in the Rocky Mountains with lodgepole pine. And I've seen it in southern Oregon back in the 70s, where it can kill just about every tree to stand. And it can also, it likes the bigger trees. Most of these things like the weaker trees. This one will can attack and take out entire stands. And that's years ago. There was they had big outbreaks in Yellowstone, and they've had them in Canada. One thing some entomologists think now is that one of the controls over mountain pine beetle in the Rockies particularly was cold winter temperatures, killing off those beetles. And with climate change, we don't have as cold winters, and they've been seeing outbreaks, that much larger outbreaks, possibly related to the lack of cold enough winters to kill them off for the winter, and probably a longer growing season. With all of these things, if you think about it, they get started earlier in the spring and persist later in the year because we've had warmer temperatures. So what do you do? Thinning can reduce stand density helps. They like dense stands. One that's common around here, you guys probably live more down in the low country like I do, but we have grand fir. It's the fir engraver, and it's common in all of our true firs. And common in trees that are weakened by drought, root disease, or wind throw, or overstocking, just too many trees breaker. And the gallery you see in the bottom of those longitudinal ones, that's pretty common. I've seen a lot. You'll see a lot of. You look at a log that's laying down, and you see a lot of transected of these galleries that are crossways in the stem. That's probably the fir engraver. So what do you do with bark beetles? There's not really insecticides you can use and the like, but the main thing is maintain well-spaced, healthy stands so that you don't have each tree has enough water to help defend itself. Replace losses with less effective species if you can. That can be limiting, but maybe if you've been losing ponderosa pine, you might favor Douglas fir or vice versa. Once again, don't create ponderosa pine slash in the spring or early summer, or if you must, get it dried out right away, because once it's dried out, it's not a problem. They can't live in dried out wood. spread-out material. And consult Washington DNR for assistance is, I got a slide with you with Sharon's name in it here in a little bit, but I'll get to that later. Other ones are root diseases. They're common root diseases are called by fungi species. So we call them a disease, but these are native plants, native fungi. And but they when they can impact our forest, depending on your objectives, they can be a problem. And they're often difficult to detect. Trees die slowly in pockets or individually, and quite often when a tree gets weakened by root disease, insects come in too. And what is the first thing you're going to see? You're going to see the insects. So sometimes they kind of work together. So you may not see this unless you chop some bark off to look. Dead tree. One thing to look for is if you have dead trees that are kind of jack-straw and fall in different directions, unlike where you might with wind throw, you might get trees that fall all in one direction. Well, look for that, and look for trees that display poor growth or color or short leaders, where nearby or healthy trees are unaffected. They're usually in little pockets, and so in the pocket in the middle, you might have dead trees, and then you have some on the edges where the foliage is discolored, and maybe the cones are real little, stress crops, and then beyond that, healthy trees, kind of a little progression of death as you move on from the middle. So some things to look for root diseases. A big one we were talking about earlier is armillaria. It's a fungus that can affect most of our conifers. Not so much western larch, but it can get Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, and grand fir, and oak, I guess, bird. But look for resin flow at the base of the tree is one thing. And if you pop the bark away, that white mycelium you see in the picture, it's almost like latex. You can pull on it. It's just very distinctive. And if you have them, you don't always have the mushrooms, but you have these honey-colored mushrooms that may be at the base of the tree. Armillaria can be immense. Eastern Oregon genotype covered some 3.5 square miles. And I've got a story about this. Maybe the largest living organism. If somehow you could bring all that together and pile it all up, it's enormous. And it's common in our areas, particularly aggressive in ponderosa pine in some areas. In the 1980s, we have an area between Trout Lake and Glenwood, one genotype, also very large. And a pathologist from Washington DNR was at a meeting, and they were talking about, instead of Eastern Oregon, there was a big one in Michigan. They said this might be the largest organism. He said there's a bigger one in Eastern Washington. Well, I wasn't at that conference, but I was reading my paper in the morning before I went to work at Trout Lake, and it was in the Oregonian little thing that said world's largest fungus, maybe near Mount Adams. Now, that's interesting. I went to work and phone rang about half an hour in work. It was the front desk. He said, "Could you take this?" And there was a TV reporter from Seattle that said, "We got a helicopter warming up. Can we see this?" They came down, several newspapers, several radio stations, and we had a entourage that went up onto the saddle between Trout Lake and Glenwood. Len Wall, Dennis, you know Len Wall. And we ran off, took an axe and popped the bark from a ponderosa spine, pulled it back, where you can see that white mycelium. He said, "There it is." The air went out of a balloon. But if you could, this is very widespread, and it can be it can be very impactful on trees. Another one that's very common is called laminated root disease, and it's in Douglas fir and grand fir. Ponderosa pine is seldom affected by this one. And this one, again, trees are typically killed in groups, creating open areas with trees on the edge showing symptoms and a progression of death as you move out. What it is, laminated root rot will infect a tree and the roots of another tree when they grow into contact with that one. And as you may know, trees, roots contact each other, and then it can spread to another tree and slowly spread out. It's called laminated because the uprooted, you see these separation of the tree rings or lamination, and they've got cinnamon red little fungi hyphae. If you look at it, it looks like cinnamon red fuzz in between the laminations, and that's where it gets its name of laminated root disease. And one thing and usually with laminated root rot, you often get a tree that's uprooted and the root system's almost all gone sometimes. There's just a ball. You see a tree with just got a ball left, and you see like laminations in the wood that's there. you may have laminated root disease. Okay, well, so what do you do with root diseases? Maintain healthy, well-spaced stands as best you can. Evaluate stands for the presence before harvest if you can. Go out there and see what you have. And then if you're clear cutting or cutting enough where you want to plant some trees, if you know where it is, you might want to plant ponderosa pine or hardwoods like oak in there, something that's resistant to it, something you can do. And as if timber is your objective. The other thing to think about, I did a plan for the Convoy National Wildlife Refuge about 10 or 12 years ago. They thinned some stands to reduce the chance of fire and it put some more diversity into them. But there was an area with laminated root disease, which meant some dead trees, the snags, more shrubs than you'd normally think of, and like we just left it alone, because they're managing for wildlife, not timber production. So based on your objective, you may want to do different things or a combination of things. Stem decays. Now these are decays that get into they're mostly fungi. They get into and can decay the hardwood and sapwood of the tree, lessening its value. They usually require an opening to get established, and they can be hard to detect if you don't have the fruiting body. If you see in that lower one, there's a conch or you guys have probably seen this mushroom that grows out of the side of a tree. You get that, you're probably pretty sure you've got a lot of loss of value in that tree. You don't hear so much about it anymore commercially. I think a lot of places they harvest smaller trees now, and you don't have so much of that, but it can be a problem. And it can be if it's near your house, it can be a hazard. They make it easier for cavity-using wildlife to excavate trees, which is a good thing. And one of them is also known as Indian paint fungus, is used as a dye by indigenous people. There are many species of stuff. Look for if you got conchs on the outside of your tree, you may have one. One that's pretty common is called pouch fungus. And it comes in after insect cavity and they get into the boreholes up by the insects. So you guys, you've probably seen this, but you'll see a tree with lots of these little tiny white mushrooms sticking all around. And that's a good sign there's been insect activity. And it does decrease the sapwood value of that tree. The stem decays. What do you do about those? Well, remove trees near your houses or campgrounds, and they can be, they can fall over. That means the structural integrity of the tree is not as good. Consider removing and replanting or thinning stands if wood production is an objective. And use care not to wound leaf trees in thinnings. One of the things we've seen over the years is if you do a thinning, you damage a tree, that's where the spores can come in. These things can get their entry on wounds. So try not to make things worse when you're thinning a stand to make it better. And where wildlife has an objective, they may provide cavities for cavity-using wildlife. So there may be a reason to leave a few. If you have one that's it's pretty rotten, and you think, well, it's not worth anything. But if it's not in a place where it's going to hurt anything, it might be. I had one in the back of my place. Ponderosa pine broke off, and I left it, and we had pileated woodpeckers in there for 1 or 2 years. And after that, the ants were gone, and they were gone. But wildlife habitat value. Cankers and rust in the area I wanted to just talk a little bit about. Something you may see is Commandra, blister rust and ponderosa pine and lodgepole pine, or western gull rust and lodgepole pine. And usually with Commandra, you'll see a little swelling in the branch and a little bit of orangish kind of it's the rust. You may see that, and it's almost it's of interest. I thought I'd show this in case, but it's very rarely does it get so much that it ruins the value of a tree. It's usually in small trees, so not too much of a worry. And western gull rust, you guys have probably all seen these knobs in lodgepole pine. That decreases the value of the life. And but again, they're not a tremendous cost thing, but anyway, something that may be of interest. Another one that has been a huge problem is white pine blister rust. And in this one, now this is an introduced disease. This one came in about the turn of the 20th century, I think, from Asia. And it is almost wiped out western white pine and white bark pine at higher elevations. And it was very devastating. We had a lot of white pine in the western United States decades and decades ago, and we have way less than we do now. However, genetically resistant trees are being utilized. They found genetically, some of them, the spore, of the rust that comes on, it'll drop the needle. And other genes, will cause the rust to grow more slowly. And they developed several genes that, with different resistance factors. And now most of the stock you buy for planting is resistant to the stuff. Not immune, but resistant. This means it's better. And even stands that have it, I've seen in Idaho where they're going ahead and managing the stand. Yeah, they're losing some trees, but they found that you can manage the stand if you do it carefully. In the 30s, one of the things they tried to do with this, they said it has a complicated life cycle, and part of its life is on a ribes or a gooseberry plant. It has to go back and forth. And they thought, hey, let's get rid of the gooseberry. So in the Depression, they had a lot of people needing work. So they sent them off to pull gooseberry, and I think this fellow in the picture is spraying them. But they tried to eradicate gooseberry. Well, guess what? That didn't work. In fact, you can pull one out, but there's roots there and it grows right back. So it probably gave a lot of young men work, but it didn't really work. Oops, I guess I got commander in there twice. What do you do about them? Well, white pine blister rust, consider you can prune to remove the cankers on branches. And if you go on the main stem, that tree may not live. But I tell you, in the 80s, we went out and we cut the canker off of a few trees, and we went back about 10 years ago and looked at them after about 20 years, and a lot of them were still alive. So, if you have not too many trees and they're of value to you, consider removing the cankers on the branches, and if you can, even off part of the main bowl, you may be able to get the tree to live. And consider replacing with white pine stock that is genetically resistant. And commander, I've got that down there. It's not a problem unless you have large amounts. I wanted to say too, the Forest Service has planted a few white bark pine up on Mount Adams. And that's the other species that's affected by this. It's not of commercial value. It's up in the wilderness and high country, but especially in the Rockies, white pine or white bark pine cones have a high fat content. And grizzly bears, it's important for grizzly bears. And so this one's a big concern. So we've been trying to keep that going. Dwarf mistletoes. This one, how many of you guys seen a dwarf mistletoe? You know what that is? I figured a lot of you probably do. There are many species specific to particular conifers. This is a flowering plant. They have and they're albuquerque. They grow on the trees and sap some of its energy and uses that to grow. Rarely kill a tree, but they decrease its growth and decrease its value. They can cause trees to grow abnormal branch proliferations called witches' brooms, which have high value for wildlife. And what they do is there's male and female plants, right? Got a botanist back there, I gotta check on them. There's male and female plants, I'm pretty sure. And the seeds are shot from all turgid receptacles, and they drop the seed onto trees below them. So what happens if you got a tree with a dwarf mistletoe? It'll infect trees underneath, particularly. Yeah. It's not a big problem unless you have infected overstory trees and young regeneration that you don't want infected. That way you can cause a great increase in it. Oops, let me see. I thought I had a slide on that. The thing to do is dwarf mistletoe. There are lots of different kinds. They're specific to the tree. So if you have dwarf ponderosa pine with dwarf mistletoe, maybe plant Douglas fir on it. Or if you have Douglas fir, dwarf mistletoe, plant ponderosa pine underneath. And if it's in small amounts, you may, depending on your objectives, it may not be that big deal. I haven't seen a lot of it in the gorge here where it's a huge problem. It's you have a small amount of dwarf mistletoe, but a couple of foliage disease I'll mention, just to know about them. Western spruce budworm is one that, about 20 years ago, we had a big outbreak in Washington here, both on the Gifford Pinchot and on land of the east. Defoliating Douglas fir, true firs, spruce and larch. I saw it when it got started real low, and real low levels, and but nobody got really excited about it until the trees turned red. And it was an outbreak, and it's it caused a mortality in a lot of trees and loss of growth in a lot of trees. Probably with fire exclusion, we probably had more Douglas fir and grand fir, more trees per acre. We probably had a situation that made it easier for that outbreak to occur. Mount Hood also had an outbreak a year before ours, and then, of course, they have it in eastern Oregon too. But it's normally at low endemic levels, occasional outbreaks. We'll see. I think we're gonna, a long time before we're gonna have another outbreak. Another foliage, oops, excuse me, this is the, what do you do? Stand thinning, greater reliance on ponderosa spine hills. They don't get it. Outbreaks probably are more severe due to lack of fire in the landscape. There are too many shade tolerant trees, Douglas fir and grand fir. So, and I'll tell you, outbreaks can be great for songbirds. We had the outbreak in the 80s up there. I remember it was evening grosbeaks. I've never seen so many evening grosbeaks in my life. Think about it, you're a bird trying to grow little ones. Man, there was a food supply like you wouldn't believe about these guys. So they got their place. Another one that I don't think we've ever had much here, Douglas fir tussing moth. There have been outbreaks in eastern Oregon and eastern Washington, and not really here. I think for the same thing. This one does not get it affects Douglas fir and true firs. And I think with fire exclusion, I think we have forests with greater amounts of those. We have a greater chance. We haven't had it here. But interestingly, that picture in the bottom, that's the Douglas fir tussing moth. That was on my deck last summer. So they are around, but you know, all these things occur, they call endemic levels. There are lots of these insects and diseases that occur at low levels. They're native. So I kind of doubt we're going to see any outbreaks of that stuff, but I wanted to bring it up just for information. A lot of you, I see a lot more people planting larch now, Western tamarack or Western larch. And there's a couple that can get in there that of interest. Larch casebearer is a little guy that eats the inner tissues, the needles, and causes them to drop off. The Montana's resource groups, we have a plantation on one of our properties just south of Glenwood. It was planted with all larch, and my gosh, it had it last year. And we just thinned that stand, but it can defoliate the tree. They can regrow needles later in the year, and repeated defoliation can kill the trees, but larch is pretty resilient. Larch will pop needles back on, so it doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be the case. There's another one that I used to get a lot of calls about because we have a larch up north of Trout Lake about hey, what's killing all the larch, and it was a needle cast, a fungus that kills needles, and it's common after a moist spring, and it's usually you'll see it in the bottom part of the tree. All of a sudden it'll kill some of the lower needles, but affects the lower crown, and the trees generally recover and grow fine. So it was the kind of thing people get excited when they see leaves or needles turn color, but not a big problem. So you may, if you see that may be what it is. Those are the things I have. I didn't have anything for Oregon white oak. This was mostly conifers, and give me a holler. I think we could get you somebody that Columbia Land Trust has a program that's great for that. But for assistance, we've got Sharon Frazee here. She's the service forester for Washington Department of Natural Resources, and she's got an assistant, Heidi Blowers, who those two are here local. So there's her information. You can talk to Sharon, and Sharon's got the capability, and you do too, of getting some assistance from some really top-notch people. Glenn Kohler, I've met him, and he's very top-notch. I think I met Dan Omdahl. I think I planted some trees with him a few years ago. So these guys are top-notch, but they cover the whole state. So I think ask Sharon first.
Yeah, I'll come out and pull out the book and see what we can find out, and then if it's a stumper, then we can call in the specialist.
Yeah, so there you have it, and I thank you for your time. Good questions? Yeah.
I had a question about spread with some of the fungus. Are there mitigations that you're doing in harvesting practices or anything to limit that, or is that?
That's a good question. One thing that you can do, I forgot to mention that, but laminated root disease, which is, when you cut a tree, it has a chocolate colored stain in there, which disappears after about 3 weeks. But I know on some sales, what they've done is they've had the loggers, when they see that, they make an X or some kind of mark with a chainsaw. Then when you go back through, when you're planting, you can say, well, we'll plant ponderosa pine or something like that in there. With armillaria, I think it's more just thin the stand and try to maintain health. I know I had, in the 80s, I had pathologists come on and look with me from the Forest Service, and in one area, they said, well, you want to favor Douglas fir here because it was really hitting the pine. In other areas, it was hitting the pine rather than the Douglas. It can react a bit differently, but I think the main thing is maintaining that health of the stand. If you, especially with nowadays we're having warmer, drier summers, and you think about it, even if it rains in the spring, when we have high temperatures, like we did last summer, we had a lot of high temperatures. The transpiratory stress on those trees is great. They almost need more water in this thing. So anything you can do to try to keep those things as as healthy as possible, as much water as possible, you're better. Then you're going to keep them in better shape, and they can resist some of these things. This is like us. If we're healthy, we can resist when we get sick better than when we're not real healthy. So that's about the best answer I can give, I think.
Do you mind if I jump in there? Just because my master's thesis is also in fungal ecology. The other thing to look out for is the types of fungi that trees associate with. So often they will either associate with something called an ectomycorrhizal fungi or an arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, with other exceptions for different functional groups. But a lot of the time they are not able to cross over those boundaries. So for example, a western red cedar will associate with arbuscular mycorrhizae versus the Douglas fir, which associates with ectomycorrhizae. And so if you're thinking about interplanting, or like Jim suggested, where you've got this patch of laminated root rot or armillaria, you can plant those different associating trees that will not be impacted by those particular functional groups of fungi. So that's the other thing. Opening up those resources, super important, but also thinking about how those resources are going to be facilitated by the soil ecology of your site.
Yeah, of course, that's a good point, Michael. And of course, we all know, I think most of you know, fungi are essential for forests and trees. So there are many, I remember I've seen pictures back in the 60s, with laminated root disease, they thought, well, I wonder if we could kill that with a fungicide. And I've seen pictures of people with gas masks on, they tried that. But they quickly realized there's a lot of beneficial stuff out there too. And it's complicated. It's hard. Yes, ma'am.
So you didn't say anything about cedar in your presentation. If, my forest is mostly Douglas fir with some ponderosa. Should I start planting cedar in there?
I would not say so. One thing I did, kind of outside the talk, one thing I didn't talk about is think about the trees you have in the ecosystems we have. So it's relatively warm and dry. If you think about it, you go on the west side where it's moister and cooler, you have more western red cedar. Over here, you get it in draws and the like. And with a warming, drying climate, remember when you plant trees, you're planting something that's going to be there for 50 or 60 years. Might not be a good idea unless you're down in it's a great species, maybe down next to the stream or something like that. But they've had region-wide, Oregon and Washington, they've seen in the last few years a decrease in western red cedar, a decline. And they think some of it is climate change. Same with big leaf maple. So we're seeing changes, and I always tell people, the thing about planting now, look 20 miles east of you. What do you have there? Probably Oregon wide open. Think about that may be the future where you are. It's so I'd be real conservative. I certainly wouldn't plant a lot of it, but maybe down along the streams, it's always good to have a variety, but don't go crazy with it because I just worry about it. Sir, Jerry?
Follow up on that one. How about incense cedar?
Incense? Yeah, you could. I've always been conservative on that. We're north of its range. And personally, I've always felt, the insects it's related with, and the like are different than we have up here. And when I was managed UCD, it was incense cedar, yeah, was an alternate host for repair rust. They told us that in Oregon. One of them said, you know, that species is an alternate host for repair rust. And we decided at the time, let's just not sell it at UCD just because I'm not sure if you're way away from an orchard, that's probably not a big deal, but I don't know if you guys have sold incense cedar.
Not for a while.
We do sell sequoia though. That's another one that could do well, sort of fulfill more so the redwood side of things, but sequoia can fulfill a similar niche gap to the cedars.
Think of your objective too. Think of your objective over the years. I had a forester was with SDS. He said sequoia. He said, well, there's not gonna be any market for it. Seriously, think about what you're planting. If that's your objective, if you want to have a tree, if you want for your grandkids or something like to be able to thin a stand and make some money off it, make sure you plant something that'll have some value. Of course, it's hard to tell what it's gonna be 40 years from now, but that's just a consideration. Yeah,
We do have some populations of incense cedar that we would planted, but over in Dewford, there's a big population. And then I found one at the top of Coyote Wall. And I also have one over here in Mosier, so they will grow here.
I have,
okay.
I have.
Native, not planted, you think?
I'm not sure. The one on Coyote Wall was interesting because it was only about this tall and it had this blue in.
We're not that far north of its range, so, yeah. Just-
I have 2 incense cedar and I was cleaning out underneath one of them and there must have been about, maybe 50 small cedars that were coming up underneath.
Wow.
Mostly in the
So-
shade.
Yeah, they were in the shade under the tree, but I was wondering if I should move those up into the woods.
You can try it, yeah. I've seen people transplant trees, do it in the early spring and, as free as possible. Yeah. You have
I do. I've been seeing porcupine damage that happened about 30 years ago. Up in Catherine Creek area, but I don't see any recent. So I'm wondering what your experience is with that. It's not an insect or disease, but
I have, when I was in the 70s in Central Oregon, we had porcupines all over. I haven't seen a porcupine in decades. I'm not sure what the deal is.
Well, we had a really big outbreak of them probably 25 years ago. I'd see them in the morning, there'd be a dead one out every morning. And, to the point where I picked it up so we could look at it close without getting hurt. But,
Yeah, they're really decreasing.
but I haven't seen them lately.
I just watched a news story about it, actually, about the porcupine line. And there's some wildlife biologists studying it because they're never been well studied. So they don't have much data on their population. There's, I think, ODF. Oregon Park.
ODFW or
Yeah, ODF.
or Fish Market.
Might be looking into it, trying to figure out why they're behind.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. I kind of heard through a friend that's orchardist up where we live on Mount Underwood. And she made a comment about that a lot of the trees up there had root disease. And another year or so later, I saw one blow over that basically didn't have any roots, so it probably had that laminate disease. But they've been doing a lot of logging, part of it might just be that the trees are mature, but I'm wondering, do you know what kind of root problem the trees up there have been having?
Well, that sounds like laminated root disease. If they're
That
falling
one
over,
did, but I don't know if that was a whole mountain, but
I really don't know. If it's had an orchard for a while, that material's gonna die out. When a tree has it, even if a tree's cut, it lives in whatever material is still there in the stump. That can live for decades. And so it can be there for a while, but that's eventually gonna die out if it doesn't have the host to live on.
well, I noticed that they have replanted it with multiple kinds of trees, not
Oh,
just
okay.
all done for.
Oh, I thought maybe it's planted as an orchard.
Well, no, I mean, they were, it was the area that they were harvesting for us, but I just wondered if you'd heard, if anybody around here had heard what it was.
I will also say it's very common to see, especially wind throw on those margins after a harvest. So a lot of those trees, when they were developing their root systems were not developing them with the exposure to that kind of wind force. And
We
so-
got a lot of that.
Okay, yeah,
Right after-
yeah, I've been seeing
right
that a
after they
lot.
Cleared it, yeah.
Mhm.
It's a lot
They
going
were
on.
used to growing in a group. They didn't
Exactly,
like
and
the
then once they're exposed to those really steep winds.
But I
Yeah.
know the one that I was thinking of, it was kind of, it wasn't around a lot
Okay,
of trees, but
gotcha.
it fell over and it's like, there's no roots there.
Yeah,
They were already processed.
Probably move on, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so.
thank you so much, Jim.
Probably time at the end.
Our next speaker, his name is Brance. He's been with the Forest Service in Region 6, Oregon, Washington, since 2001, and worked on every single Region 6 national forest there is, probably even ones that don't exist anymore. In 2023, he came to the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area, where he's part of a small team specialist planning and implementing restoration. And I'll let him probably explain the rest of this one. Brance, please.
Thank you. You might want to get where you can see my slide.
Oh, yeah.
This one will be slide heavy, so
Gotcha.
can we dim the lights a little bit?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
There you go.
Thanks. So can you see my slides?
Yeah.
It wasn't. It's got a storyline, so.
Booty.
That better?
I don't know how the screen looks.
Oh, that's good.
All right.
It looks good track here.
Okay, thanks. So I'm the botanist, as you said, at the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area, and I've worked for the Forest Service for a long time. Mostly, the important thing for background is that, the scenic area consists of about 300,000 acres of private land, state land, federal land, and, tribal land, and I always think that's important to understand. 85,000 of the acres are US Forest Service land. 35,000 of those acres are wilderness, so we really only have about 50,000 acres that we're actively in. And then it covers from the Sandy River Delta all the way to the Chute. So today I'm going to talk about fire history and ecology of Burdoin Mountain. It's not the full Burdoin Mountain, but a little smaller area. And I thought this was cool because this is from Coburg Beach in about 1920. And the reason that I wanted to show this is because mostly what you're seeing up on the hillside there is oak. You can tell by the round form there. You see a little bit of conifer coming in up here, a little bit up here. And then we'll come back to that later, but I just want to show you that. But here's today. Not a great picture, but you can see all of this conifer encroachment in the oak. And yeah, anyway, we'll come back to that. But a pretty neat comparison. Ooh, there you go. The area I will be discussing is 60 miles east of Portland. Most of y'all know it. And closest town is Bingen. Some people might say White Sand. Courtney Road comes off of Highway 14 and climbs up towards the top of Burdoin Mountain. And on this slide, you can see all the Forest Service lands in green. Before the westward movement of European Americans, the fire return interval for the east side forests of the scenic area would have been about every 3 to 6 years of low intensity fire intentionally started by indigenous people. These were culturally informed fires that supported indigenous ways. These low intensity fires would have selected for the shade intolerant, fire resistant Oregon white oak and ponderosa pine and created an open, healthy forest. I just thought that was a nice photo. As this area was increasingly populated, fire suppression began to change these forests by allowing shade-tolerant Douglas fir to move in. Douglas fir moved in on the wind and began to occupy the oak forests, in turn overtopping the oaks and killing them by shading the oaks out. So here's a photo where you can see tons of Douglas fir. There's probably some ponderosas in there too, but they're overtopping those oaks. This is a map. This map is showing satellite imagery with Forest Service lands outlined in green. This imagery was taken in the late fall and shows distinctly the conifer distribution, which I'm always looking at this, and you can see, so we have Forest Service lands here, and then you can see private lands and other lands, and, oh, actually so the oak, I was supposed to point this out, the oak is all this kind of gray stuff in between, and then the conifer is all the green that you're seeing in here. In the early 2000s, the Forest Service completed an evaluation of all Forest Service lands in the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area. In this process, it was determined Burdoin Mountain, among other places, were a priority area in need of treatment due to the patchwork of ownership, the high potential for wildfire, and the presence of Oregon white oak. Here you can see the patchwork of ownership overlaid with the wildland-urban interface layer, which is a WUI. And WUI refers to the area where human development, such as houses and communities, meets or intermingles with undeveloped wildland vegetation. You can see a lot of the area is intermixed, meaning it has human development mixed with undeveloped wildland vegetation. So it's pretty easy to understand why we would want to treat these areas. There's a higher risk of fire in these dry forests because of fire suppression, which has allowed fuels to build up. They are dry due to low annual precipitation and because they are close to human ignition sources like Highway 14. Oregon white oak is a priority species for the Forest Service. Due to land development and fire suppression, Oregon white oak is experiencing a decline in its populations. There's been a 95% loss of Oregon white oak habitat in Oregon and Washington since settlement by European Americans. Oregon white oak is a keystone species. It supports up to 436 invertebrates, 200 vertebrates. Some of those are western gray squirrel. So the western gray squirrel, I recently found out that they like the open understory. So when the conifers encroach, they don't feel safe to come down to the ground. So when we've been thinning these stands, they actually are moving back in. This photo shows black-tailed deer, the western gray squirrel, and if anybody knows that owl right there, there's a I think it's a barred owl, but that barred owl was actually active or watching me while I was collecting data. It was pretty funny. Flew in and was like, "What are you doing?" Down in the bottom right, you can see the armillaria fruiting bodies that's attacking that oak. I think the oak is dead too. And then the top right is what causes white heart rot, which is an interesting fungus that's common. It doesn't kill the oak, but it does create cavities, or it helps create cavities. And a lot of times those trees, when we get fires, the fire gets in those and then it'll burn out the whole inside of the tree. Oh, there's my little video. From the Forest Service land evaluation, it was determined Burdoin Mountain had departed from its natural condition due to fire suppression, which increased the total density of the forest, increased fuel loads, and increased the number of conifers. The presence of conifers increases susceptibility of eastside forests to high severity stand replacing fires because their needles have high resin content, which is very flammable. In general, oak leaf litter is not very flammable. The conditions must be just right to burn it. We've tried burning it here recently, even in October, and we were not successful. In this photo, you can see how dense this forest is. Way too many stems per acre to maintain a healthy forest. You can see ladder fuels, which can bring fire from the ground into the canopy, and you can also see the continuous horizontal fuels represented by the crowns touching. So this one, I have the info that I'll show you here in a second. But in a forest like this with a wind-driven fire, you'll get torching of trees and then rapid horizontal spread from the embers of the torching trees and spotting ahead of the flame front. Here's an example of a conifer torching. It's pretty incredible to see. So this little bit of information talks about thinning before fuel reduction and then after fuel reduction, but reducing young conifer density is the way to reduce potential for high severity fire. So the Forest Service decided to remove the small diameter Douglas fir, less than 10-inch DBH, pile the material and burn it. There would also be some thinning of the oak forest to try to understand how the oaks would respond to the treatment. Then where it was safe, we would try and underburn. All right, here's a video that shows what I mean when I say thinning and piling. A lot of people don't know. This was created by Friends of the Gorge. They're a great partner for us. So hopefully it's not gonna blast the sound. Is this the one that controls sound?
Got the remote.
Yeah, it should be at a
Good.
suitable volume, yeah.
Brace yourself.
Hey, Gorge friends, it's Brance. We're out here at Legacy Pine today. I wanted to show you something. So we're out here, we have these 300, 400, 500-year-old ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, even Oregon white oaks that are, in their few hundred years old. But this is one of those places that hasn't seen fire. And the last one I found is 60 years ago. And we need to bring fire back in here, but one of the repercussions of not having fire in here is that the Douglas fir has encroached. And when the Douglas fir encroach, then they start killing out the things we like, for example, ponderosa pine and Oregon white oak, because they're not shade tolerant. So the Douglas fir comes in and shades them out and eventually kills them. So we're here today. We're doing some thinning. So last week we were curious, like, how old do you think those trees are out there? But here you can see 100, 200, 300, and then 371 years old. And that's not even as big as this tree right here. So this isn't from this tree. This is from one down there, but look at how big this is. So I have to believe that this tree is at least 500 years old. So what we're gonna do is open all this up. We're gonna cut out all the Douglas fir, open this up. Oregon white oak are gonna regenerate nicely. Will hopefully expand into the spaces. And then the ponderosa pines will become the large overstory. So if you look behind us here, you can see one of those 400-year-old ponderosas that was here before the Douglas fir. So as we're coming in this area, you can see there's a bunch of pipe, and that's all Douglas fir material. And so if you can imagine, look back over there, this area is untreated, and then you come over here, and this is how much material we took out. And then next year we'll burn all these out. So that's the end of that. Any questions from that video? Any questions before all of this, anything? And then I just wanted to include a couple examples. Here's what we're doing when we're out there pile burning different forest types. The one on the left is more of a Douglas fir forest type where we just reduced fuels, and then there's a Oregon white oak with a little bit of conifer there on the right. Here, I just want to demonstrate what a low intensity prescribed fire looks and smells like. This was up in Glenwood. I think James was there. I just love that crackle.
What month was this?
This was in October. Here's a firefighter dragging a drip torch, which is typically how we'll light these fires as we walk. So this is Burdoin Mountain in 1948. This photo has great resolution, and from it, I can determine tree species distribution and change over time by comparing these photos to current imagery. These are some of the oldest aerial imagery I have found. There are some of the 30, I think they're the Fairchild photos, but their resolution isn't very good. I've not been able to determine any significant fire events in the past 100 years. The only evidence I can reliably count on is the age of the oaks. And most of the oaks in these stands are about 150-year-old, with some scattered older ones. The oldest ponderosa pine I have found is around 300 years, and that was up on Courtney Road where it takes the east-west bend. with 140-year-old ponderosa pines nearby, and then the rest of the forest composed of the 150-year-old Florida white oaks. The 140-year-old pines, I have to assume, are the progeny of the older pines since it's the only seed source around and there are no other stumps. The 300-year-old ponderosa pine shows wolf tree characteristics, leading me to believe it was an open-grown tree for most of its life, which is a clue to the previous fire history. I have a sample of this 300-year-old ponderosa pine that I just cut yesterday. The tree fell over, and so I was able to cut a cookie from it, and now I'm gonna be able to count the rings to figure out. It looks like there are multiple fire scars in it, so I'll be able to figure out some pretty good fire history, and it looks like it shows some low intensity fires too. The next time I do this, I'll have that one. So wolf trees, I want to mention that they're trees that are open grown. They don't have any competition, so they develop all their branches and generally hang on to them. This one experienced some recent fire, which you can see killed the lower branches, which is typical. All of this evidence leads me to believe there was a fire that swept through this area in about 1870 that killed the tops of many of the oaks. The oaks resprouted from their root collar after their top has been killed. So what we were seeing is the resprout from the 1850s as mature trees. Here's an oak cookie, and then what I wanted to say is you can see the release at the center of this oak cookie, the one over there. So the rings are larger in the middle. And I feel like that has to be from the nutrient flush post-fire. And I have a few other cookies that I'm piecing the puzzle together. And then you can see how the tree slows down those growth rings. And I think that was about a 9-inch tree. Yes.
Will you show exactly how you determine the fire?
Oh, this one is the fire from this one was just the age. Because I was basing it on the other trees, because I've collected a bunch of cookies and they're all about that age.
Okay.
And then the flush, which these are assumptions of mine. Because these rings are so big, I'm assuming that it was a nutrient flush from that fire. And so it was making those sprouts shoot up.
Okay.
But that's a good question. Did you have a question?
It could also be just didn't have much competition with getting going after, so it had a lot of room in it. That's common with trees that grow real white rings at first and then they
Yeah,
slow
like
down.
the release, yeah. And the only reason I would counter that is because it doesn't have a bunch of close neighbors, right? So,
Yeah, gotcha.
but yes, that is exactly true. Let's see, there's also evidence of the underburns, which we've conducted up there in these areas. So you can see this tree right here. This was from, I think, 2016 when we underburned there. And it looks like it had a little bit too much fuel built up around it. And so we could have been a little more careful, but little oak mortality is not too bad. Let's see. Oh, so yeah, on the oaks, I typically collect cookies where I can because pouring oaks with a borer is like you either break your borer, you dull it, or you end up with it stuck in the tree. So I try and collect them with chainsaw as much as possible. This photo is pretty interesting. This happens a lot up there where you have these clonal clumps. And I assume, because you can see they're on mounds, that these trees are possibly 1,000. You know, the root system is about 1,000-year-old because fire came through, killed that tree, it resprouted. Fire came through, it resprouted, and they slowly spread out in these clonal clumps. And it's kind of cool because you can see this big oak here, and this one probably made it through a bunch of fires, but this one's seen repeated fire. And this was after the Burdoin fire, pretty much right after, but you can see all that green stuff is poison oak. And then here is just an example of what happens to Douglas fir in low intensity fires. The needles are scorched and they're done. The interesting thing about these is they've been living in the understory and the shade, and these are about 12 years old and they're only about that tall. And I don't know, so you can tell the age of a tree by counting its whorls. So each one of those is a year. I feel like that's a really good thing to know when you're going into a forest, so you can generally know how old the trees are. Let's see. So from fire suppression, Douglas fir began moving into the oak stands and ponderosa pine moving into the grasslands, moving from west to east via seed dispersal, as the west wind is the predominant wind direction in the gorge. In open places like Catherine Creek, it is easy to see the pattern of establishment, with oldest conifer being on the west side and younger ones to the east. So here's an aerial imagery of Catherine Creek, a satellite image. I just like looking at these. You can see over here that these ponderosas are in these little bit of wet areas, and then you can see the seed dispersal from the wind moving them that way. And I guess the tallest trees have the biggest shadows. Oh, and actually, yeah, there's a little patch down there too. So I love comparing. So this is 1948 on the left, 2016 on the right. And in 1948, you're just looking at oak. I can't see really any ponderosa, but over here, you got this same shape basically, but then you have ponderosa right here. It's all coming. There's a few here and there, and most of these have blown in from below Coyote Wall. The seeds have blown up and over. And I just learned something else today too, that they actually did oak thinning in those oak stands and ponderosa thinning about 10 years ago. But in the Burdoin fire, those ones on the right, most of those were killed. And if not killed, then I feel like the beetles are gonna get them, hopefully. I like ponderosas in the right place. So this is in the last switchback up Courtney Road. And I think this one's pretty interesting because over here you see a little bit of conifer poking up here and there, but then look at this one. Like, look how much conifer is filled in all of these areas. Yeah, even up in here, pretty much mostly Oregon white oak. All right, this is another example of classic conifer encroachment, overstocked Oregon white oak stand. And then here's an area that we treated. We removed all of the conifers except for the ponderosas. We typically leave the ponderosas when they're in the Oregon white oak because they're not shade tolerant, so they can live together. Let's see. And then in 2025, as most of you know, we experienced a wildfire thought to be human caused. The ignition point was down here somewhere, we think off the road. And I was told that it took about 8 minutes for it to get all the way up here. So it spread up here. You can see these draws. It was really blasting up here, and we lost a few houses in that, unfortunately. It was a wind-driven west wind, 30-mile-an-hour gusts. The interesting thing is once you get up in that bowl, though, as the wind hits the wall, it kind of pushes up and it swirls back around. So once we got up into these areas here, the fire kind of settled down a little bit too. And also, these were all the places that we removed conifers. And so we like to think that maybe helped the fire behavior slow down a little bit. And generally on Forest Service lands, the ecological benefit was great. So I like this photo. I love Google Earth now, or Google Maps, because you can zoom in on some places, but this is in 2024 before the fire. This was just after the fire, which I know this looks bad, but all these trees are alive and pretty excited about what happened in there. A lot of the bunch grasses are coming back. And then here was just the other day, which you can see all the resprouting of the new grasses. Well, that's all I got.
Yes. Questions for Brance before we let everyone escape?
What again was the name of the, I believe it was fungi that moves into a white oak and you see these big, huge white oaks that got burned out.
Yeah, it's called white heart rot, but Anacutis dryophylla, I believe, it's the oak loving dryad. Yeah. Yes,
So on that photo, I have not seen an oak savanna burn and recover. What would be your prediction on what's gonna happen with those trees? Are they gonna like sprout up from the ground again, or do you think that
so in
they'll be up in the upper branches and sprout out from there? How many in a typical landscape, how many of those trees are just gonna start all over again, and how many of them are gonna be able to sprout from above?
So in this picture, I think we're gonna get 100% of these trees sprouting from their branches. Because they didn't have any cambium damage down low. But if you're driving around in the fire perimeter and you see those white stems, the ones that are like really white and have lost their texture, typically those, the cambium has been killed and they're just gonna resprout.
So it was mostly just a flashy grass, light fuel, and it wasn't hot enough then to kill a big bold oak?
Well, there were different fire effects that happened, and when it got into here, it was really slow and creeping around. And Courtney Road is right here, and I was told by the firefighters that were up there that they weren't really concerned about what was going on in there because it was holding so well, and they were able to actually hold on. Let's go back. Okay. Did I get it? Yeah, so that was a photo taken from right here. And they weren't really concerned about it, so they were able to take the dozer down the road using that as a containment line. And they were able to wrap the fire right here, and you know how fast the dozer goes, it's like 3 miles per hour. So they were able to drive the dozer line and wrap around the whole fire because it was moving so slowly in that area. But then in other places, you know, you had, most of the fuel was grass, and so the grass was just flashing off because 30-mile-an-hour wind, it's just gonna flash through and then drop the seeds to the ground. And I got a video from a woman who lives on Windy Bluff Road, and she stayed in her home. And she showed me the video of the smoke coming over, and then it basically skipped over about 100 yards and then back burned into her yard. She didn't feel scared or anything, I guess. I mean, she didn't have enough time to get out. So, what's that?
Could you see?
Yeah, I think the smoke came to the south and then moved up above her and around.
The breeze response. But get back to the oak picture, are those native grasses resprouting? Because I thought a lot of the grasses in that area were not.
That's, so that's it. Let's go back to, is that forward? Yeah, so this has a mix of bunch grasses and non-native weeds.
Okay, so it's mixed here.
It's definitely, I mean, it sounds like, you know, there are a lot of non-native
Yeah, like
grasses.
lower at Catherine Creek more so.
Yeah, but if you ever get a chance to go walk through this stand, it's pretty cool. It does have a lot of bunch grasses.
Okay. Now,
Yes.
I have another question. Back to your comment about thinning oaks, I heard that right. Okay, my question first is, well, how would you? I mean, you cut it to the ground, it's gonna sprout back. And then the second question is, why exactly would you?
Well, the reason that I would thin oaks is because I'm trying to mimic what a fire would do without putting a fire through there. And so generally what I'm doing is I have this full canopy and I'm removing these intermediates and overtop trees, these ones that are in the shade and they don't like shade. So the hope is that they won't resprout. And then you're gonna get a healthier overstory.
How's that going?
It's going great.
Is
Yeah,
it
yeah.
not resprouting? How
No,
long?
and actually this is a great example because this has been oak thinned, and it looks amazing. So, and I'm not saying that oak thinning works in every forest. Because every forest is different and, you know, aspect, wind direction. Yeah, so in some places you shouldn't do it, but I'm always thinking, how would a fire have moved through here and changed this stand? Anybody else? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
I think if anybody else has questions, feel free to, stick around and just, we can answer questions either for UCD or for the speakers. And thank you so much for being here, Brance and Jim.
Yeah,
It's wonderful.
thank you all for being here.
Yes, yes. And sign up for the newsletter so you can stay up to date on our events. Thanks for being here, Barbara.
Wait, I forgot. Hold on. I brought some oat cookies. Not to eat. These are some of the samples that I took. Can't see what that says. I think that's 175. And this one's 150 years old. And then here's a Douglas fir that's 13 years old.
Ancient.
Oh, and I have, here, hold on now. I got this other really neat one to show you.
Sorry, I forgot my props.
That's great.
Oh, here you go. So this,
Oh, yeah. Oh, geez.
this right here.
Oh, that's awesome.
What does this say? 29-year-old Douglas fir. Sitting in the understory of Oregon white oak.
Hanging in there.
It didn't make it.
Oh.
This one's pretty cool because this one actually shows the fire scar right here. And then you can see where it healed over. It has these lobes that heal over. And so this gives me a direct, like, exactly when the fire was. I can count moments to do that. So if anybody wants to eat
You wanna
it.
throw those on here?
Yeah, you guys can.
Yeah, check it out.
Yeah, that's the fire scar. Feel free to have a look. Anyway, thanks.
Did you need to sand those down to get them? Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah,
I tried to do Google, I didn't know.
this is so hard.
Didn't realize.